The penthouse gleamed under a constellation of carefully placed lights. 60 floors up, the city was a silent, sparkling carpet. This was Elena Vance's domain, and tonight, every glass surface, every piece of sleek furniture reflected her power. The air hummed with low conversations, the clink of crystal, and the soft, expert melody from the grand piano in the corner. The pianist, a man in a tailored suit, flowed through a jazz standard, his music a perfect, invisible thread weaving through the evening. Elena moved through her guests like a shark, smooth, purposeful, always observing. She wore a dress the color of midnight, simple and brutally expensive. Her smile was calibrated, warm enough to be convincing, sharp enough to remind everyone who had built the company they were here to celebrate. This dinner was for the firm's most crucial investors, a display of stability and cultured success. The art on the walls was modern, the wine was ancient, and the pianist was supposed to be flawless. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the one person who wasn't a guest. Her assistant, Maya, stood near the kitchen doorway, a shadow in a simple black dress. She was a fixture at these events, a silent, efficient ghost who anticipated needs before they were spoken. She refilled a glass here, whispered a reminder to the caterer there, her expression a mask of calm professionalism. But Elena, who paid for that mask, saw the subtle signs. The slight tightness around Maya's eyes, the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve for a second before stilling. She was nervous. Good. It meant she was on alert. The problem began not with a crash, but with a whisper. The head caterer approached Maya, his face pale. Maya listened, nodded once, and then her mask slipped for a full 3 seconds. Elena saw pure dread flash in her assistant's eyes before the calm reset. Maya weaved through the crowd toward her, moving with a grace that was almost unnatural. "Elena," Maya said, her voice low, meant only for her boss's ear. "A small issue. The pianist. He's had a severe allergic reaction to the shellfish canapes. The paramedics are with him in the service elevator." Elena's smile didn't waver, but the temperature in her immediate vicinity seemed to drop. "And the replacement? We have a roster. I've called everyone on the list. The earliest anyone can get here is 90 minutes. Maya's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she held her tablet. 90 minutes of dead silence. Or worse, the tinny sound of streamed music from a speaker. It was unthinkable. This crowd fed on ambience. Silence would be a vacuum, and into that vacuum would rush judgment. They'd question her preparedness, her control. The elegant ecosystem of the evening was about to collapse. Elena's gaze cut back to the magnificent piano, now a silent, mocking monument. Her mind raced through solutions, discarding each one. Then a memory surfaced, clear and sharp. 3 years ago, reviewing Maya's resume, fluent in 3 languages, degrees in business and organizational psychology, and under personal interests, classical piano training, grade 8 distinction. It had been a trivial line, a hint of a life outside the office. Until now, she looked at Maya, really looked at her. The assistant was always so contained, so quiet. She spoke only when necessary, her movements precise and economical. The idea formed, cold and perfect. It wasn't just a solution. It was a statement, a demonstration of absolute authority. Her employees weren't just cogs. They were resources ready to be deployed in any direction she chose. "You play," Elena stated. It wasn't a question. Maya blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The piano. Your resume said you trained. You'll play." Elena's tone was conversational, as if suggesting she fetch more napkins. The blood drained from Maya's face. "Elena, that was a very long time ago. I'm not a performer. I haven't played for an audience in years. Consider this a low-pressure audience. They're here to talk business, not critique Chopin. Elena placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly to anyone watching, but felt like a steel clamp. It's a simple request. We have a need. You have the skill. This is what being a team player looks like at the highest level. She then turned, raising her voice just enough to cut through the murmur. Ladies and gentlemen, a minor change in the program. Our talented musician had an unexpected appointment. But fortune smiles on us. It turns out my incredible assistant, she gestured toward Maya, who looked frozen in place, is also a gifted pianist. She's been kind enough to agree to share a little music with us tonight. A wave of polite, curious attention shifted to Maya. A few of the guests smiled, intrigued by the novelty. An older investor, a man with sharp eyes named Mr. Thorne, raised an eyebrow, his gaze thoughtful. Another, a younger venture capitalist, hid a smirk behind his glass. They all saw it for what it was, a power move. The rich boss, showing she could command even the private talents of her staff for the evening's entertainment. It was a bit eccentric, a bit ruthless, and utterly fascinating to watch. Maya stood paralyzed. The room, once a map of tasks to manage, now felt like a prison. Every exit was blocked by a smiling, expectant face. The gentle lighting felt like a spotlight heating her skin. She could feel the weight of Elena's expectation and the quiet amusement of the crowd. To refuse would be professional suicide, a public defiance. To comply felt like a violation of something sacred she had locked away long ago. Maya, Elena said, her voice sweet but with a finality that echoed in the sudden quiet. The piano is waiting. That broke the spell. Maya's survival instinct, the one that made her an excellent assistant, kicked in. She gave a tiny, stiff nod. Moving as if in a dream, she walked toward the grand piano. The path felt miles long. The murmur of the guests resumed, now tinged with a new gossipy energy. She reached the polished bench. The ivory keys seemed to glow, threatening and familiar all at once. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She could smell the faint scent of lemon polish and old wood, a smell that instantly transported her to a different room, a different lifetime, filled with fear and crushing loss. She closed her eyes for a second, swallowing hard. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the bench. It was too high. She adjusted it mechanically, the simple action feeling absurdly intimate under so many watching eyes. She placed her hands in her lap, staring at the keys. A memory flashed, unbidden. A vast, silent concert hall, a sea of shadowy faces, and the terrible, echoing silence that came after a wrong note, a stumbled passage, the moment everything fell apart. She pushed it down. She had to play something. Anything. Something simple, technical, emotionless. She chose a Clementi sonatina, a piece for students, all crisp scales and cheerful, empty melody. She placed her fingers on the cool keys, took a shallow breath that hitched in her chest, and began. The notes were perfect. Each one clear, precise, and utterly lifeless. Her posture was ramrod straight, her face a pale, blank mask. She played the music correctly, but the soul of it was gone. It was a ghost of a performance, a technical demonstration. The guests listened for a minute, then mostly returned to their conversations. The piano now just background noise again. The novelty had worn off. Mission accomplished for Elena, who watched with a satisfied glint. The silence had been averted, but not everyone had tuned out. Mr. Thorne hadn't moved. He stood slightly apart, his drink forgotten, his eyes fixed on Maya. He wasn't watching her hands. He was watching her eyes. They were wide, focused on a point miles beyond the music stand, glistening with a sheen of unshed tears. He saw the tremor in her shoulders she fought to control. He heard not the simple notes, but the immense, screaming effort it took to produce them. And when Maya reached the end of the first movement, her fingers faltered for a fraction of a second on a turn of phrase, a specific, delicate hesitation that was not in the written music. It was an interpretation, a tiny ghost of musicality that had broken through her wall of control. At that tiny flourish, Mr. Thorne's breath caught. His head tilted, as if recognizing a voice from long, long ago. Elena, noticing his rapt attention, felt the first faint trickle of doubt. This wasn't just humiliation or obedience she was seeing. There was a story here, buried deep beneath the perfect, lifeless notes. And against her will, she found herself listening not to the music, but to the silence that screamed between every perfectly played note. The final, clean note of the Clementi sonatina hung in the air for a second before it was swallowed by the gentle clatter of resumed conversation. Maya's hands fell from the keys into her lap, curling into tight, cold fists. The applause was a brief, polite patter, like distant rain. It wasn't for her. It was for the boss's strange little spectacle, now concluded. She didn't look at anyone. Her entire world had narrowed to the grain of the wooden piano bench beneath her, the faint, shimmering after-image of the black and white keys. The familiar panic, the one she had spent years burying under spreadsheets and schedules, was a live wire in her chest. But she had an exit strategy, the same one she used after any high-stakes meeting. Vanish, regroup, return flawless. Standing up, her legs felt like they didn't belong to her. She gave a small, stiff nod in the general direction of the room, a performer's bow that was more of a flinch, and walked, not toward the kitchen, but toward the floor-to-ceiling glass doors leading to the wide, empty terrace. She needed cold air. She needed the sky. She needed to be anywhere but in that room full of warm, perfumed people who had just witnessed a piece of her soul being sanded down in public. The door slid open silently, and the city's night rush hit her a deep, windy hum 60 stories below, 1,000 lit windows like scattered stars. She let the door sigh shut behind her, cutting off the party's noise. Out here, the curated perfection of Elena's world met the vast, indifferent chaos of the city. She gripped the chilled metal railing, her knuckles turning white again, and just breathed, trying to steady the earthquake inside, not inside. The party's equilibrium had been restored, but a subtle crack had appeared. Elena, accepting a compliment on the unexpected entertainment, noticed the old investor, Mr. Thorne, hadn't moved. He was still by the piano, staring at the now empty bench. He wasn't smiling. His expression was one of deep, unsettling recognition, as if he'd seen a ghost walk through the wall. Then he moved, not toward Elena, but toward the terrace doors. Elena watched, her social smile freezing on her face. This was not part of the script. The guest of honor was following the help. A thread of annoyance pulled tight in her stomach. She had orchestrated this to show control, and now the pieces were moving on their own. On the terrace, Maya didn't hear the door open. The wind snatched the sound away. She jumped when a calm, quiet voice spoke beside her. That little turn in the second phrase. The hesitation before the resolution. It was very specific. Mr. Thorne stood a respectful distance away, leaning on his cane, looking out at the view. He didn't look at her. Most students play it straight from the page. You made it? Breathe. For a moment. Maya wiped hastily at her eyes, though no tears had fallen. It's just a common sonatina. I played it as written. Her voice was thin, scraped raw. No, he said gently, finally turning his head. His eyes were old and kind, but sharp. You played it as he taught it. Alistair Finch, that was his fingerprint. He loved those little breaths, those sighs in the music. He called them the heartbeats between the notes, I'd know it anywhere. The name was a physical blow. It stole the air from Maya's lungs. The city below seemed to tilt. She couldn't speak. She just stared at him, the mask of the perfect assistant gone, replaced by pure, naked shock. "You were his student," Mr. Thorne said, not asking. A numb nod was all she could manage. "A long time ago." He spoke of a young woman near the end, his brightest in a decade. He said she had a rare touch, but a fragile spirit. He was so worried for her. His gaze was full of a sorrow that seemed decades deep. Then he passed, and she vanished from the world of music. I always wondered what happened to her. That was it. The fragile spirit shattered. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a path down Maya's cold cheek. She turned her face away, back to the abyss of the city. "I stopped," she whispered, the words ripped out by the wind. "After he was gone, I couldn't anymore. The music just died." Inside, Elena had had enough. The scene through the glass, the old man's intense conversation, her assistants turned back, the intimate stillness of it felt like a rebellion. It was her party, her employee, her narrative. She excused herself from a group with a laugh that was a bit too sharp and pushed open the terrace door. The wind caught her dress. "Mr. Thorne, I've been stealing all your time. They're about to bring out the 48 port," she said, her voice bright and commanding, a hook to pull him back to where he belonged. He turned, his moment of quiet connection broken. He gave Maya one last, lingering look, a look that held an entire conversation in it, then nodded to Elena. "Of course. A legendary year." He patted Maya's shoulder once, a fatherly gesture that made Elena's eye twitch, and walked back inside, leaving the two women alone in the windy dark. The silence he left behind was thick and heavy. The sounds of the party were a muffled dream. Elena didn't look at the view. She looked at her assistant. Maya was still gripping the railing as if she might fly away, her body rigid with the effort of holding herself together. The annoyance in Elena curdled into something else. This wasn't just stage fright. This was a wound, old and deep, and she had just poured salt directly into it. She had wanted to see competence, maybe a little fear. She hadn't wanted to see this profound, quiet devastation. It was messy. It was human in a way that made Elena deeply uncomfortable. What did he want? Elena asked, her tone cooler now, all party host brightness gone. Maya took a shaky breath. "He knew my teacher, so? You took piano lessons. He's a music lover. It's a coincidence." Elena stated it, willing it to be true, needing the world to be that simple. "It's not a coincidence," Maya said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, a fragile thread of defiance. "My teacher was Alastair Finch. He said," Mr. Thorne said the way I played a note, it was like Finch's signature. The name meant nothing to Elena. It was just a name. An artist, a ghost. "And that upset you? An old man recognizing an old teacher's style?" Maya finally turned to look at her. In the ambient light from the penthouse, her eyes were pools of reflected city lights and raw pain. "You asked me to play. You didn't ask why I stopped. You didn't ask why it was on my resume from 10 years ago as a personal interest and not my profession." She swallowed. Alastair Finch wasn't just a teacher. He was. He was the only one who believed I could be more than just technically good. He died, very suddenly, the night before my final conservatory recital, the most important performance of my life. The story began to tumble out, quiet and broken by the wind. She spoke of walking onto that huge stage, knowing her mentor, her anchor, was gone. Of the thousands of eyes. Of the piano that felt like a trap. Of playing the first few bars, and then her mind going utterly, terrifyingly blank. The notes vanished. Her hands froze. The silence in the hall had been a living thing, crushing and complete. She had run off the stage, the sound of her own choking sobs echoing in her ears. The dream of a life in music dead in that single, public, humiliating collapse. I haven't played for anyone since, Maya finished, her voice a ghost of itself. Not a soul. Until tonight, when you made me. The word hung between them. Made. Elena stood very still. The wind whipped her hair around her face, but she didn't feel it. She was trying to process. She saw the event now, not as a clever power move, but through Maya's eyes. A forced reliving of her worst nightmare for the casual amusement of rich strangers. The piano was no longer just furniture. It was the site of a trauma she had commanded be reenacted, a strange, unfamiliar feeling twisted in Elena's gut. It wasn't guilt. She didn't do guilt. It was more like the disorientation of realizing a calculation was based on entirely wrong data. She had seen a line on her resume and seen a solution. She hadn't seen the person. Why keep it on your resume then? Elena asked, not as a challenge, but because it was the only practical question her mind could latch onto. If it caused so much pain? Maya looked down at her own hands, the pianist's hands that now only typed and poured coffee. Because a part of me is still that girl, the one he believed in. Erasing it felt like erasing him, and the part of me that could ever create something beautiful. She gave a small, hopeless shrug. It was stupid. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Elena's mind, usually a map of strategies and outcomes, was blank. She had uncovered a tragedy, and she was the villain in it. It was an inelegant, uncomfortable truth. Go home, Elena said finally, her voice devoid of all its usual edge. It was flat. Tired. Maya looked up, confused, wary. The party. I'll manage. Tell the caterer you're unwell. Just go. Elena wasn't looking at her anymore. She was staring out at the city, but she wasn't seeing the lights. She was seeing the young woman fleeing a stage, and herself standing in a penthouse, forcing her to walk back onto it. Maya didn't argue. She just nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and slipped back inside, a shadow melting into other shadows. Heading for the service elevator, for escape, Elena stayed on the terrace, alone. The perfect party glittered behind the glass. She had won. The silence had been filled. But for the first time in a very long time, Elena Vance felt the cold, and it had nothing to do with the wind. The penthouse felt different after Maya left. The laughter seemed louder, more hollow. The clinking of glasses had a sharp, fake sound to it. Elena moved through the rest of the evening on autopilot, her smile a mechanical thing she switched on and off. Her mind was not on the investors or the port wine. It was stuck on the terrace, on the raw pain in her assistant's voice, on the name that meant nothing to her, Alistair Finch. She kept seeing Maya's hands, those clever, capable hands that managed her entire life, trembling on the piano keys. She had commanded a performance and accidentally opened a vault of someone else's grief. It was an operational error, a miscalculation of human resources. That's what she told herself. But the feeling in her gut, that cold, sinking disorientation, wouldn't listen to logic. The last guest finally left, ushered out with flawless, empty charm. The heavy door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was immense. The grand room was a battlefield of half-empty glasses and abandoned napkins. The piano sat in the corner, dark and silent, like an accusation. Elena poured herself a glass of water, not wine. She walked over to the instrument, her heels loud on the polished floor. She stared at it. This piano. She had owned it for 5 years. She'd won it at an auction, a decadent impulse buy. She liked the look of it, the rich, dark wood, the elegant curves. It was a statement piece, a symbol of a refinement she had bought, not earned. She never played it. She hadn't even really listened to it until tonight. Alastair Finch. Why did that name itch at her brain? It was just a name. A dead piano teacher. But Mr. Thorne's reaction, the specific, haunting way he had said it, and Maya's devastation. On a whim, a strange impulse she couldn't explain, Elena opened the long, smooth lid that covered the keys. The ivory gleamed in the low light. She reached out and pressed a single key in the middle. A pure, resonant C note bloomed in the silent room, loud and lonely. The sound faded slowly, hanging in the air. She looked at the empty music stand. Then, on another impulse, she knelt down, her expensive dress brushing the floor. There was a small brass handle on the front of the piano bench. She tugged it. The seat lifted, revealing a shallow storage space inside. It wasn't empty. Dusty and forgotten lay a few sheets of old, yellowed music. On top was not sheet music, but a simple, leather-bound notebook. She had never looked in here. The piano had arrived, the bench with it, and she'd never thought to check. She lifted the notebook out. The leather was soft, worn at the edges. She opened it. The pages were filled not with musical notes, but with handwriting. A man's handwriting, elegant and flowing, but hurried, as if the thoughts were coming too fast. The young girl today, the quiet one with the fierce eyes. She has it. Not just technique. A sorrow she pours into the minor keys. It will either break her or make her a true artist. I must be careful. Elena's breath caught. She turned a page. Tried to call home again. No answer. The silence there is a different kind of music. One I cannot bear to hear. Another page. Sold the viola today. The last of it. The money will keep the studio open a little longer. These children, they are my symphony now. The only one that matters. Her heart began to beat a strange, thick rhythm in her chest. She flipped toward the back, her fingers clumsy. The entries became shorter, more scattered. The doctors use words like aggressive and time. I have so little of it. Must prepare them. Especially my little shadow. She is not ready to be alone with the music. And then, near the very end, a final entry. The writing was shakier. A desperate scrawl. If you find this, know I left the world listening. To a perfect, imperfect chord from a student who finally understood. It is enough. It has to be. Forgive the silence. Elena sank back onto her heels, the notebook held loosely in her hands. The room seemed to tilt. The scattered pieces, two separate tragedies, suddenly slammed together in her mind with terrible, perfect clarity. Alastair Finch. Her father. Not the name he'd used when he left. He'd gone back to his middle name, the one connected to his mother, to his life before a wife and a daughter he couldn't seem to love enough. Alastair, the artist, the teacher, the man who had chosen a roomful of other people's children over his own. Maya's words echoed in her head. He was the only one who believed I could be more. He had given that belief, that fatherly guidance, to a stranger while his own daughter built a life out of proving she never needed anyone. A wild, painful laugh choked in her throat. The coincidence was too monstrous, too cruel. The piano she had bought as a trophy, a beautiful thing to own because he had loved beautiful things, was his. His actual, physical piano. The bench held his private thoughts. And she had forced his favorite broken student to play on it, for a joke. The humiliation she had intended for Maya was nothing compared to the humiliation that crashed down on her now. She had been mocking her own father's memory. She had been torturing a woman her father had loved like a daughter. The cold feeling on the terrace became a freezing, howling storm inside her. She didn't sleep. She sat on the floor in the silent, dark penthouse, the notebook in her lap, staring at the piano until the city lights outside began to blur with the first gray light of dawn. When Maya arrived at the office the next morning at 7, her eyes were puffy, and her face was carefully, professionally blank. She expected to be fired. Or, worse, to have to continue as if nothing had happened. She had her resignation letter drafted on her phone, ready to send if the first words out of Elena's mouth were cold. Elena was already there. This wasn't unusual. But the scene was. The CEO's office was dark, the blinds still drawn. Elena wasn't at her desk. She was standing by the window, her back to the door, still in the same clothes from the night before. They were wrinkled. Elena Vance was never wrinkled. Maya paused in the doorway. The reports from last night's. She began, her automatic professional script kicking in. Close the door, Elena said, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't used it in years. Maya did, her heart sinking. This was it. Elena turned around. The morning light from the window behind her lit her in silhouette, but Maya could see her face was pale, stripped of its usual armor. She looked exhausted, and something else lost. Alistair Finch, Elena said. The name was a stone dropped in the quiet room. Maya flinched. I'd prefer not to discuss it further. If my performance was unsatisfactory. He was my father, Elena said. The words made no sense. They hung in the air between them. Impossible. Maya stared, her mind refusing to connect the two worlds. The fierce, lonely, brilliant man who spoke in metaphors and saw music in everything. And this cold, sharp, empire-building woman. That's not possible, Maya whispered. His name was Robert Alistair Finch. He left when I was 8. He went back to using Alistair. The musician. The teacher. Elena's voice was flat, empty of emotion, just stating facts. I bought his piano at an estate sale 5 years ago. I didn't know. I just liked the way it looked. Maya's legs felt weak. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. The man who had been her anchor, her savior in music, was the same man who had abandoned the girl who had become her tyrant. The world folded in on itself, nonsensical and cruel. Why are you telling me this? Maya asked, her voice trembling. Elena looked at her, and for the first time, there was no mask, no strategy. Just a raw, confused pain. Because I made you play on your teacher's piano. My father's piano. And I didn't know. I thought I was just... She trailed off, unable to say the words humiliating you. I found his journal. In the bench. He wrote about you. The quiet one with the fierce eyes. A sob itched in Maya's throat. She covered her mouth with her hand. To hear that he had written about her, that she had existed in his private thoughts. It was a gift she never expected. A gift delivered by the last person on earth she would have wanted it from. Elena took a step forward, then stopped, unsure. He believed in you. A lot. It's all in there. The two women stood there, separated by a vast, painful history that had just become tragically intertwined. One grieving a father who left, the other grieving a father who was found and then lost. Both abandoned by the same man in different ways. The morning silence at the office was heavy. The usual sounds of the city waking up were a distant hum. What do you want from me? Maya finally asked, the employee still in her, needing a directive, a task to manage this impossible situation. Elena looked out the window again. I don't know, she said, and it was the most honest and most terrifying thing Maya had ever heard her say. I needed you to know. Before anything else. I needed you to know that what I did last night, It was worse than you thought, and I didn't even know. The silence in the office wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. The ghost of a brilliant, absent father. The ghost of a failed concert. The ghost of a humiliation that had just rewritten its own history. Maya felt the ground beneath her life shift, cracking along a fault line she never knew existed. She couldn't look at Elena. She stared at the gray carpet, her mind spinning. Her teacher, her maestro, the man whose approval had been the sun in her musical sky, was the same man who had left this woman, her boss, in a permanent, cold shadow. The anger she'd carried for years, anger at his death, at her own weakness, now tangled with a bewildering thread of pity for the woman standing before her. He never talked about a family, Maya said, her voice small. He talked about music. And silence. He hated silence. A bitter, hollow sound escaped Elena. It wasn't a laugh. He left us in plenty of it. She walked stiffly to her desk, not to sit, but to lean against it, as if her legs wouldn't hold her. What was he like? As a teacher? The question surprised Maya. It was a human question, not a boss question. She looked up. Elena's face was still pale, but her eyes were focused, desperate for data of a different kind. He was. Patient, Maya began, cautiously, but not soft. He could hear a single note out of place in a complex piece. He said music wasn't about being perfect. It was about telling the truth, even if the truth was ugly. She remembered his kind, tired eyes. He was sad, I think. A deep-down kind of sad. We all felt it. We thought it was just the artist in him. It was the guilt, Elena stated, the words sharp. He was good at running away from that. Maya felt a flicker of defense for the old man. He didn't run from us. He was there, every lesson, even when he was sick. He believed in us until the end. Lucky you, Elena shot back, the old armor snapping back into place for a second. Then she closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. The armor fell away again, leaving only exhaustion. I'm sorry. That was... I don't know what this is. Maya took a deep breath. The professional in her was screaming to leave, to quit, to run from this radioactive mess. But the girl who had loved her teacher, who carried his last words in her heart, couldn't. What was in the journal? About me? Elena opened a drawer and gently placed the leather-bound book on the desk. She didn't hand it over. It was too sacred, too loaded. He worried about you. He said you had a fragile spirit, that the world might break you. He wanted to make you strong enough to survive it. She looked directly at Maya. He called you his most promising student, his little shadow, because you watched everything. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, hot and fast. They were tears of grief, but also of a strange, aching validation. He had seen her, really seen her. To have that confirmed, by of all people the daughter he'd left behind, was overwhelming. He would have hated what I did last night, Elena said quietly, more to herself than to Maya. Using his piano. Using you. It was the exact opposite of everything he. She stopped, unable to finish. For the first time, Maya saw her boss not as a force of nature, but as a person. A person who was, in that moment, utterly shipwrecked. The realization was disorienting. What do you want to do? Maya asked, repeating her earlier question, but the meaning had changed. It wasn't what is my task. It was, how do we navigate this? Elena looked at the journal, then out the window. I don't know how to fix this. I don't fix things. I build new ones to replace the broken ones. She shook her head. But I can't replace this. Her gaze settled back on Maya. He believed in you. And I broke that, again. The word again hung there. It covered her father, and now it covered Maya. An idea, fragile and terrifying, began to form in Maya's mind. It was the kind of idea that comes from a place beyond fear, from a deep old loyalty. He had a favorite piece, she said softly. Not for concerts. It was too simple. He called it the soul cleaner. He played it when he was troubled. He taught it to me once, a long time ago. Said it was a map for when you were lost. Elena was completely still, listening. I could play it, Maya said, the words feeling dangerous on her tongue. On his piano. Not for a party. Just to play it. For him, maybe. She didn't finish. Maybe for you to hear who he really was. The implication was clear. Elena's first instinct was to reject it. It was messy, emotional, pointless. But every other instinct in her life had led her here, to this moment of terrible clarity. She gave a single short nod. When? Now, Maya said. Before I lose my nerve, she thought. They left the office without a word. The ride in Elena's silent car to the penthouse was filled with a thick, heavy quiet. They weren't employer and employee. They were two strangers linked by a ghost, traveling to a common graveside. Back in the penthouse, the morning sun streamed in, exposing the remnants of the party. The piano looked different in the daylight. Less like a trophy, more like a relic. Maya walked to it slowly. This time, there was no audience. No smirking guests. Just the quiet and the sun and the woman who was the daughter of her teacher. She lifted the fallboard, reeling the keys. She adjusted the bench, the same familiar mechanical process, but her hands weren't shaking. She didn't speak. She just placed her fingers on the keys, closed her eyes for a moment, and began Dot. It wasn't a famous sonata. It was a short, melancholic piece by a lesser-known composer. All slow, rolling chords and a simple, searching melody that wound its way through them. It was music that asked questions, didn't give answers. As Maya played, she wasn't thinking about technique. She was thinking of the old man's hands demonstrating the phrasing, his humming along, the way his face would soften when the resolution finally came. She played it as he had taught her with those little breaths. Those heartbeats between the notes. The music filled the sunlit room, not with party cheer, but with a profound, gentle sorrow. It was the sound of regret, of love that was complicated and painful, of a goodbye that was never properly said. Adelina stood by the window, her back to the room, looking out. But she wasn't seeing the city. She was listening, really listening. She heard the sadness Maya had described. She heard the patience. She heard, for the first time in her life, her father's voice. Not the voice of the man who left, but the voice of the teacher, the artist, the man who tried to guide fragile things through a hard world. Dot. This was the man her mother had loved. This was the man who had left. They were the same person. The understanding was a physical ache in her chest. The piece ended not with a dramatic chord, but with a single low note that faded into nothing, leaving a peaceful, clean silence behind. Maya kept her head down for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The old fear was there, but it was quieter now, soothed by the act of playing something true, for the right reasons. Elena didn't turn around for a long time. When she did, her eyes were dry, but something in her face had relaxed. A tension she must have carried for decades finally released. He loved you. You know, Maya said quietly, still facing the piano. In his way. He talked about the weight of disappointing people. I never knew who he meant. Now I think he meant you. Elena didn't answer. She walked over to the piano bench, not to Maya, but to the other side of the instrument. She ran her fingers along the rich, dark wood. Can you? Elena started, then cleared her throat. Can you teach me? Not to play, just that piece. The notes. Just so I can. She struggled, the words foreign to her. So I can touch something he loved. The right way. Maya looked up shocked. In the boss's face, she saw not a CEO, but a little girl, 8 years old, wanting a connection to a father who was always turning away. It's very simple, Maya said, her voice gentle. Just a few chords here. She shifted over on the bench, making space. After a heartbeat of hesitation, Alana sat down beside her, her movements stiff and awkward. Maya pointed to a key. Start here. Just press it, gently. Alana, who commanded boardrooms, pressed the key as if it might bite. A soft note sounded. Good, Maya said. It was the first time she had ever given her boss approval. Now the next one, together. Slowly, note by clumsy note, under the morning sun, the billionaire CEO and her assistant began to piece together a fragment of a melody. It was halting. It was full of wrong notes. But for the first time, the music in the penthouse wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. And it was the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined just a day before. The wrong notes were many. The rhythm was non-existent. Alina's hands, so sure when signing million-dollar contracts, were clumsy and heavy on the keys. But for 20 minutes in the sunlit penthouse, the two women worked on a single, simple phrase. Maya would play it smoothly, the notes flowing like water. Then Elena would try, her brow furrowed in concentration, pressing each key with deliberate, awkward care. Softer, Maya said once, her own voice surprising her with its gentleness. It's not a button you're pushing. It's more like you're catching the sound before it falls. Elena, who was used to giving orders, accepted this one without a word. She tried again, and the note bloomed more gently. It wasn't really a lesson. It was an act of archaeology. They were gently brushing dust off a connection that had been buried for 30 years. When they finally stopped, the silence felt different than before. It wasn't empty or heavy. It was thoughtful. Thank you, Alana said, staring at her own fingers resting on the ivory. The words sounded strange coming from her. Maya just nodded. There was no manual for this. No schedule to follow. The world, however, kept turning. Maya's phone buzzed discreetly in her pocket, a reminder for Elena's first meeting. The spell broke. They weren't just two daughters of the same ghost. They were still CEO and assistant. But the ground between them had irrevocably shifted. Elena stood up, smoothing her wrinkled clothes. The mask of the executive didn't snap back into place as easily as before. It was cracked, and the real person beneath was peeking through. We should get to the office, she said, but it lacked its usual driving force. The following days were a strange, silent dance. The work continued with the same brutal efficiency. Memos were sent, meetings were held, deals were advanced. But the atmosphere had changed. Elena stopped barking orders. She started saying, please, and could you? It was subtle, but to Maya, it was as shocking as if the walls had changed color. Elena didn't mention the piano again. Hey. But Maya noticed things. A book on basic music theory appeared on the corner of Alana's desk, half hidden behind a stack of reports. Once, walking past the open door of Elena's private office, Maya saw her standing by the window, moving her fingers silently on the windowsill as if tracing an invisible keyboard. Mr. Thorne, the investor, called. Not for Elena, but for Maya. Elena put the call through herself, her expression unreadable. My dear, Mr. Thorne's warm voice came down the line. I've been thinking. There is a small foundation I advise. We support artists who have stepped away, who need a gentle path back. There is a studio, a beautiful, quiet space. No large audiences. Just a few friends, fellow musicians. We would be honored to have you use it. Whenever you wish. No expectations. Maya's throat tightened. It was everything she had been too afraid to even dream of. A safe space, no pressure, just the music. She looked up at Elena, who was pretending to read a document, but was clearly listening. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, Mr. Thorne said. It's what he would have wanted. And if I may, I have his old metronome. I think it belongs with someone who would understand its ticks. Tears pricked Maya's eyes. Thank you. I will consider it, truly. When she hung up, the office was quiet. Elena kept her eyes on her paper. It's a good opportunity, she said after a moment, her tone carefully neutral. You should take it. It would require a flexible schedule, Maya said cautiously, testing the new unsteady ground between them. Elena looked up then. Then we'll make it flexible. It was a statement, not up for debate. You've managed my life for years. You can manage your own hours. It was the first real gift she had ever given her, and it wasn't a bonus or a trinket. It was the gift of time, of possibility. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Weeks later, the invitation arrived. A simple, creamy card. A small recital at Mr. Thorne's foundation studio. 4 performers. Maya's name was listed third. The piece was not the dramatic concerto she had once failed at, nor the simple soul cleaner. It was something in between, a piece of quiet strength and deep emotion. One her teacher had loved. The day of the recital, Maya was a storm of quiet nerves. She dressed simply. She went to the studio alone, early, to feel the space. It was just as Mr. Thorne had said. Warm, intimate, lined with wood that made the air feel soft. There was a piano, smaller than the grand in the penthouse, but beautiful. On its music stand, wrapped in plain paper, was a small, old wooden metronome. She touched its polished side and felt a surge of calm. She didn't know if Elena would come. She hadn't said she would. She hadn't said she would not, as the small audience filtered in perhaps 30 people, mostly friends and patrons of the foundation. Maya peeked from the side. And there she was. Elena sat in the back row, dressed in a simple, dark suit, looking out of place and entirely determined to be there. Their eyes met for a second. Elena gave a single, small, almost imperceptible nod. Then it was Maya's turn. Walking to the piano, she felt the old fear rise, a cold wave in her chest. The silence of the room was expectant. She saw the faces, kind and curious. She saw Mr. Thorne, smiling encouragingly. And in the back, she saw Elena, her posture straight, her gaze steady. This was not the vast, judging hall of her memory. This was a room full of witnesses, not an audience. She sat. She thought of her teacher, not the ghost of his death, but the warmth of his belief. She thought of the woman in the back who was learning for the first time who her father had been. She began to play. The music that came out was not the flawless, frozen perfection of the penthouse. It was alive. It had breath. It had the little hesitations that were heartbeats. It had moments of tremendous power and passages of whispered sorrow. She didn't play to prove anything. She played to speak, to say the things she and Elena could never say to each other. Asterisk, I am broken too. I understand loss. I am trying to be brave. Asterisk, she lost herself in it. The fear didn't vanish, but it walked beside her, and she played right through it. When the final chord faded, the silence held for a beautiful, suspended moment. Then the room filled with warm, genuine applause. Not the polite patter of the penthouse, but the sound of true appreciation. Maya stood, her legs steady. She bowed, her eyes finding Elena's in the back. Elena was not clapping. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. But on her face, in the clear, bright light of the studio, there were 2 clean tracks of tears, silently falling. She made no move to wipe them away. Afterward, there were congratulations, Gentle handshakes. Mr. Thorne embraced her, his own eyes damp. He heard that, he whispered. Every note. Elena waited until the crowd around Maya had thinned. She approached, looking more unsure than Maya had ever seen her. You were? Elena began, then stopped, struggling for the right word. Not efficient, not effective. Beautiful. Thank you, Maya said. And then, because it felt right, she added, for being here. Elena just nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out a simple, flat, rectangular package wrapped in plain paper. For you. Not for now. For later. Back in her own small apartment that night, Maya opened it. It was a framed sheet of music. Not a copy. The original. The handwritten score for the Soul Cleaner piece, the one she had played that morning in the penthouse. In the bottom corner, in that elegant, flowing script, was a dedication. Asterisk for my little shadow, so you may always find your way back to the music. F. Asterisk, he had written it for her. All those years ago. She held it to her chest, weeping for everything that had been lost and for the strange, fragile thing that had been found. The next Monday, Maya arrived at the office at her new later time. On her desk was a single envelope. No stamp. Just her name in Alana's sharp handwriting. Inside was not a memo. It was a photograph, old and slightly faded. A young man with kind, intense eyes was smiling, sitting at a piano. A little girl, about 8, with fierce, dark eyes, was sitting beside him, her small hands resting on top of his on the keys. On the back, in a different, feminine handwriting, it said, Asterisk Robert and Elena, 1987. Asterisk beneath that, in Elena's modern script, were just 3 words. Asterisk, he heard you. Asterisk. Maya looked toward the door of the CEO's office. It was open a crack. From inside, faint and halting, came the sound of someone picking out a single simple phrase on a piano. One note at a time. Getting it wrong. Trying again. Maya sat down at her desk, a soft smile touching her lips. She opened her schedule, and then, almost as an afterthought, she opened a new browser tab. She typed in 2 words, adult piano lessons. The search results came up. She didn't book anything. Not yet. But she left the tab open, a small window of possibility, glowing beside the demands of the day. Outside, the city hummed, relentless and unchanging. But inside the quiet office, a new melody, fragile and full of wrong notes, was slowly being learned.